The alarm cut through my headset before the console had even finished lighting up. Every panel in the cockpit switched to red at once. A distress call from Halden Station, already 40 seconds old, and losing signal fast. Kestrel, this is command. You are clear to launch. Repeat, clear to launch. Commander Grace Hollis kept her voice level, but I had flown under her long enough to hear the strain underneath it. I did not wait for a second order. My hands moved before my mind caught up. Throttle forward. Canopy sealed. The launch bay doors slid open onto a wall of stars, and the Kestrel dropped free of the cruiser Vigilant. The engines lit and shoved me back into my seat hard enough to blur my vision for a moment. "Talk to me," I said. "Skarn raiders." "At least 6 ships, maybe more behind them," Grace answered through the comm. "Halden's shields are down to 40% and dropping. There are still people in the lower ring who did not get out in time." My stomach turned over. Daniel Pierce worked the lower ring generators. I did not say his name out loud. There was no time for it, and saying it would not make the Kestrel fly any faster. 2 more ships fell into formation beside me. Call signs Redtail and Osprey, fellow human pilots from my own squadron. A pair of Corvi fighters, part of the joint patrol that had kept the Verge quiet for 3 years, peeled in from the far side of the station to cover our flank, and nobody on any channel needed to explain the plan out loud. We had trained together long enough to simply fly. Osprey clicked twice over the comm, our old signal for confirmed hostile count, and Redtail answered with one clipped word: visual. We had run this exact drill so many times in simulation that the real version felt almost familiar, right up until the first shot crossed close enough to rattle the Kestrel's frame and remind me that nothing about this was a simulation anymore. Grace's voice stayed steady in my ear the entire approach, calling out shield readings and raider positions in the same even tone she used for training runs, and I understood, even then, that the comm was as much for our benefit as for her own. Halden Station came into view sooner than I expected, a wheel of pale metal turning slowly against the dark, with 4 raider ships circling it like they were still deciding where to cut first. Weapons fire lit the space between us in thin, bright lines that vanished as fast as they appeared. I threw the Kestrel into a hard bank, the G-force pressing the air out of my lungs, and came up behind the nearest raider before it knew I was there. "Grace, their shield generator is on the north tower," I said, reading the pattern of their formation, the way she had trained me to. "Take that down and the rest of them lose their lock." "Do it. I am bringing the Vigilant in on a wide arc. I need 40 seconds. 40 seconds felt like an hour. I pushed the Kestrel harder than I ever had, weaving between drifting debris and raider fire, Redtail and Osprey covering my flank. A hit clipped my rear stabilizer hard enough to spin me half a rotation before the automatic correction kicked in, and for one long second I lost sight of the tower entirely, my display flooding with warning icons instead of a target lock. Osprey's voice cut through the static, warning me that a second raider was swinging wide to come at my flank, and for 3 or 4 seconds I had 2 problems stacked on top of each other with no clean way to solve either one first. "Kestrel, report," Grace said, sharper now. "Still here, correcting." I found the tower again, filled my sights, and held my breath before firing. The tower's shield flickered, buckled, and dropped. "Tower is down," I said. "Copy. Hold position. All craft, hold position." That was the part nobody in command had approved. Grace was not supposed to bring the Vigilant this close to an active engagement, not without clearance from the Council liaison assigned to our sector, and definitely not without waiting for the reinforcement window scheduled 6 hours out. 6 hours might as well have been 6 years to the people still trapped in that lower ring. She brought the cruiser in anyway. The Vigilant dropped out of its holding pattern and cut across the Raiders' formation, its full weapons array trained on the ships still circling the station. It did not fire first, it simply arrived, close enough and fast enough that the Raiders broke formation to avoid a collision, scattering away from Halden and into open space, directly into the paths Redtail, Osprey, and I had already sealed shut. I will not describe in detail what happened to those 4 ships. I will only say that within 90 seconds, Halden Station's shields were climbing back past 60%, and the raiders, still able to fly, were running, not fighting. Lower Ring reports all personnel accounted for, Grace said, her voice cracking, just slightly, with relief she rarely allowed herself to show. Kestrel, Redtail, Osprey, good flying, bring it home. I did not find out until after we had docked that Daniel had helped seal the last airlock himself, 30 seconds before Grace brought the Vigilant across the sky, like something out of a story told to frighten raiders at bedtime. He did not thank me when I found him afterward, soot smudged along one sleeve and his hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline. He just gripped my shoulder once, hard, and walked away to check on the generator he had nearly lost his life protecting. Grace found me there a few minutes later, helmet still under one arm, and for just a moment, before her professional composure returned, I watched something in her face that looked almost like fear, not of the raiders, but of what she had just chosen to do without asking anyone's permission first. I did not think, standing there in the docking bay with my ears still ringing, that any of this would end up in front of the Galactic Council. I certainly did not think it would end up being treated as a problem. 3 weeks later, I stood in a hall built from pale corvi stone, high enough that sound echoed strangely off the ceiling, and none of it felt like relief anymore. The Concord Hall had been built centuries before humanity ever reached the stars, its walls carved from stone quarried on the Corvi homeworld itself, and every delegate seat curved outward from a central floor in a slow rising arc, so that no matter where you stood, you always felt slightly beneath everyone else in the room. I had stood in that gallery a dozen times before and never once felt small in it. That day, for reasons I could not yet name, I did. Word of what had happened at Halden had apparently traveled through council channels faster than any of us on the security detail expected, exaggerated in places, understated in others, until the version that reached the full chamber barely resembled the 4 raider ships I remembered chasing off myself. The Galactic Council did not summon witnesses often, and almost never for a rescue, but Commander Hollis's decision to move the Vigilant without prior authorization had been noticed, logged, and escalated through 3 separate review boards before landing on the full Council's docket, and today the Council intended to address it directly. I stood near the back with the rest of the human delegation's security detail, close enough to Ambassador Claire Bennett to see her jaw stay perfectly still through the entire proceeding. Councillor Drom spoke first, as he always did. He represented one of the Council's oldest founding seats, and he wore his authority the way older species often did around humans, like a teacher losing patience with a clever student who kept forgetting the rules everyone else had long since memorized. Commander Hollis acted without council clearance, Drom said, each word measured and unhurried. She deployed a warship inside a contested engagement zone, in direct violation of joint operating procedure. This body cannot allow such conduct to continue unaddressed, regardless of outcome. Regardless of outcome, I watched Grace's face when he said it. She did not flinch, but something in her shoulders went very still, the way a person goes still when they have decided, quietly, not to give anyone the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Beside Drom, a second delegate, a narrow, pale-eyed representative from one of the smaller founding worlds, leaned toward his microphone. I would add that this is not the commander's first instance of deviation from standard protocol. The pattern itself is concerning, regardless of individual results. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through several other founding seats, small nods and the soft rustle of delegates leaning toward each other, the kind of unspoken consensus that usually meant a matter was already decided before anyone bothered voting on it. Ambassador Bennett rose. She was not loud. She had never once, in the 2 years I had guarded her, raised her voice in that chamber. Councillors, will the record reflect that Halden Station's lower ring was fully evacuated, with no losses, because Commander Hollis moved when she did? Drom did not even glance at the report in front of him. The outcome is immaterial to the violation. Procedure exists precisely so outcomes are not left to individual judgment. So the answer is no. The answer is that this council does not reward improvisation with praise, Ambassador. It cannot, or every officer under every flag will believe their own judgment outranks this body's authority. I expected Bennett to argue further. I expected her to raise her voice, or at least her chin, the way she sometimes did before making a point she intended to win outright. Instead, she was quiet for 3 full seconds, long enough that even Drom seemed to notice the silence had weight to it. Then she closed the folder in front of her, stood fully upright, and said only, "Thank you, Counselor. That is all I needed to hear." She did not wait for the session to be formally closed. She turned, and the rest of the human delegation rose with her, myself included, and we walked out of the Concord Hall together, our footsteps echoing against that same strange pale stone. Behind us, I heard the murmur of the chamber rise, confusion first, then something closer to alarm, though none of them called out to stop us, and I do not think any of them, in that moment, believed they needed to. I fell into step just behind Bennett's shoulder, close enough to speak if she wanted, and I studied her face the entire walk to the transport. She did not look angry. I had seen her angry once before, months earlier, over a stalled trade dispute, and this was not that. This was something quieter, and considerably harder to argue with. She looked finished. I had guarded her through 2 years of disputes over trade routes and border surveys and mineral rights, arguments that dragged on for months and ended in compromises nobody fully liked. I had never once seen her simply stop participating in one. Whatever calculation she had just finished making, she had made it alone, and she had made it fast. I did not know it yet, standing on that transport ramp with the Concord Hall shrinking behind us, but the council was about to learn exactly how much of the Verge's peace had never really belonged to them at all. Nobody in the Concord Hall believed the walkout would last. They had seen humans hold firm positions before, on trade terms and border disputes, and every single time, patience and a slightly better offer had eventually brought us back to the table. I understood, later, why they assumed this would be no different. What none of them accounted for was that this time we were not negotiating for a better deal. We had simply stopped needing the deal at all, at least for as long as it took the council to remember what it actually wanted from us. I learned that within a week, back on Earth, sitting in on a debrief with Grace Hollis and 2 officers from Fleet Command. The room smelled faintly of recycled coffee and stale conditioned air, the kind of small windowless briefing space that every fleet base seemed to have at least a dozen of, and nobody in it looked like they had slept properly in days. One of the officers read out a translated line from an internal council memo and could not quite keep the disbelief out of his voice as he did. "Counselor Drom's office is telling the other delegates this is a negotiating tactic," he said. Their exact phrasing: "Humans are prone to dramatic gestures they quietly reverse once the economic cost becomes clear." Grace did not laugh. "Do they have a timeline for how long they expect that cost to take?" "A couple of weeks, maybe less, if we prove less stubborn than they expect." The other officer in the room, a quiet woman who had said almost nothing through the entire debrief, finally spoke up. "And if we are not back at the table in 2 weeks?" Nobody answered her directly, though I noticed Grace's expression did not change at all, as though the question did not particularly interest her. Ambassador Bennett had not set a single deadline, had not issued a single ultimatum. She had simply stopped answering the council's requests for a formal session, and instructed every joint operation along the Verge to stand down from combined patrol duty until further notice. It was not framed, anywhere in her official statement, as punishment. It was Earth, quietly stepping back from a partnership that had never once been reciprocated when the cost of reciprocation actually mattered. I felt that decision most sharply on the day Daniel Pierce shipped out from Halden Station. We stood on the same docking ring where I had watched him seal an airlock 3 weeks earlier, except now his kit bag sat heavy over one shoulder, and a Corvi engineer named Yarrell was helping him carry the rest of his equipment toward the waiting transport. "They are keeping the station running with half the maintenance crew," Daniel said, not quite meeting my eyes. Yarrell is staying. I am not allowed to. For how long? However long the ambassador wants, I suppose. He tried for a smile that did not quite land. Feels strange, walking away from a place I basically bled for. I did not correct him, though nobody had actually bled that day. It was simply his way of describing what the station had cost him, in nerves and sleep, and the particular fear of watching a generator fail, with people still trapped behind it. Yarrell shook his hand, said something low in Corvi that I did not catch, and Daniel climbed the ramp without looking back, though I noticed his shoulders stayed tight the entire way up. I stayed on the docking ring longer than I needed to, watching the transport clear the station's outer marker and fold into transit, and I found myself thinking about all the small, unglamorous ways two crews had learned to rely on each other over 3 years. Shared meals during long shifts, borrowed tools nobody bothered logging, a dozen private jokes that only made sense to people who had once spent a night together waiting out a hull breach. None of that showed up in any council report, and I suspected that was exactly the problem. I asked him once, months later, whether he regretted leaving. He said the only thing he truly regretted was how quiet Halden Station grew in the weeks after, and how long it took anyone in the council to notice that quiet for what it was. I understood what he meant a few weeks later, when Fleet Command forwarded me a routine supply manifest from Halden, the kind of document nobody usually reads for anything beyond inventory counts. Requests for spare parts had dropped by nearly half. Maintenance backlogs, once resolved within days through informal trades between human and Corvi crews, now sat unresolved for weeks at a time, logged and relogged through channels that had never needed to exist, when a problem could simply be solved by walking down the corridor and asking a friend for help. It did not take long. Fleet sensors along the verge, the ones still quietly monitoring old shared frequencies even after the joint patrols formally stood down, began logging Skarn scout activity in sectors that had gone untouched for 3 full years. Not raids yet. Just probing runs, single ships slipping close enough to read a station's shield strength before pulling back into the dark. I saw the first report cross Grace's desk and did not think much of it at the time. Scouts probed constantly, even during quiet years. It was the pattern building behind them that should have worried me sooner than it did. Within days, the probing runs had tripled in frequency. Within a couple of weeks, they were no longer retreating quietly. I was on relay duty at Meridian Point, a small human listening post just inside our own border, when the call came through. Not a formal council request, routed and stamped and delayed by procedure, a raw, unencrypted distress signal from Corin Outpost, a council-run station many hours from the nearest fleet response. Assuming that response was even authorized to launch without clearance, nobody currently had the authority to grant. This is Corin Outpost, requesting any assistance. Our shield array is failing, and we have 3 Skarn ships inbound. The voice on the recording was young, and trying very hard not to sound as frightened as the words themselves clearly were. Repeat, requesting any assistance at all. I brought it straight to Grace before the recording had even finished looping. "It is not our sector anymore," she said, before I had gotten 3 words into my own explanation. She did not say it like she believed it. She said it like she was testing whether I would push back against it. I pushed back. Corin's civilian population is over 400 people. Half of them are Corvi families who used to invite our engineers over for dinner on rotation, back when rotation still meant something. You know that as well as I do. I know it. Grace rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the last few weeks catching up to her all at once. I also know Fleet Command has been very clear that we are not to re-engage Council-designated sectors without direct authorization from the Ambassador's office, and the Ambassador's office is not currently taking Council requests of any kind. This is not a Council request, Grace. Corin did not send this to the Council. They sent it to anyone listening, on an open channel, because they clearly do not expect the Council to hear it in time. And if I send you, and the Ambassador's office decides this counts as exactly the kind of unilateral action she has spent weeks refusing to authorize, Grace asked, though her hand was already reaching for the comm as she said it. Then I will explain it to her myself, after, I said. She can decide what she thinks of it, once 400 people are somewhere safer than a burning outpost. Grace looked at the recording playing on her screen for a long moment, her jaw working slightly. Then she picked up the comm and called Fleet Command directly, cutting through 3 layers of routing protocol to reach an actual person instead of an automated queue. I do not know exactly what she said on that call. I only know that 4 minutes later, she turned to me and spoke a single word. Go. I did not need a second order that time either. I took the Kestrel out with 2 escort craft. No Corvi wingmen this time, no joint call signs recognized by anyone on the other side of that border, just 3 human ships, crossing a line we technically were not supposed to cross without paperwork that did not yet exist. Corran Outpost came into view, already burning along one docking arm, its shields flickering weakly against fire from raiders who had clearly grown bold enough to stop pretending they were only scouting. We did not have a cruiser this time. We did not have the numbers we had brought to Halden. What we did have was 3 years of muscle memory built from flying beside pilots who no longer happened to be in the formation with us, and that memory turned out to matter more than I expected it to. What we had was 3 fast, well-flown ships and a very clear idea of exactly where Corran's evacuation shuttles would need a corridor held open. I will not walk through every maneuver of that engagement. I will say it was harder than Halden had been, that one of my escort craft took a hit to its wing stabilizer and had to peel off early, venting atmosphere from a hull breach small enough not to be fatal but large enough to end its part in the fight, and that by the time reinforcements from the nearest council garrison finally arrived, well over an hour after our own unauthorized arrival, we had already cleared enough of a path that every family aboard Corran's evacuation shuttles had reached the relative safety of open space. I remember one shuttle in particular, its outer hull scorched along one side, drifting for nearly a full minute with its engines dark before its pilot finally coaxed it back to life. Close enough that I could see small shapes moving behind its viewports, people who had no idea how close they had come to not making it at all. I did not learn until later that one of those shapes had been a child no older than 6, traveling alone because her parents had stayed behind to help seal a bulkhead. I thought about her for weeks afterward, an entire small life that had nearly ended over a jurisdictional argument about which fleet was authorized to answer a distress call in time. It was not the kind of thought that made flying any easier, but it made the choice to go easier every single time after that. The Council Garrison Commander thanked us over an open channel, visibly confused about who we even were, since nothing about our arrival had come through any official channel he recognized. Grace was not thanked by anyone above her. The garrison commander's gratitude did not travel any further up the chain than his own private channel, and I noticed nobody in Fleet Command seemed eager to forward it. She was summoned to a formal inquiry 2 days later for authorizing an unsanctioned deployment into a council-designated sector without ambassador clearance. I sat outside that inquiry room for close to 4 hours, and when she finally came out, she looked more tired than I had ever seen her, though she also looked, unmistakably, like someone who would do it again without a second's hesitation. "What did they say?" I asked. "That I set a bad precedent." She almost laughed, though there was no real humor in it. That if every commander starts deciding for themselves when the rules do not apply, we will have chaos instead of policy. "Did you tell them Corran would have had 400 fewer people alive without that particular bad precedent?" I told them exactly that, in those words. She started walking toward the transport bay, and I fell into step beside her, the way I always did. They told me the outcome was immaterial to the violation. I asked her if she planned to say that to anyone else, maybe put it in a formal complaint of her own. She shook her head before I had even finished the question. What would that accomplish? They would simply write a longer memo explaining why the rule still applies. I would rather spend that energy making sure the next call gets answered faster than the last one. I stopped walking for a second, because I recognized those words instantly. They were Counselor Drom's words, the exact phrase he had used against her 3 weeks earlier in the Concord Hall, except this time they had come from our own fleet command, from people who were supposed to be standing on our side of every argument. That was the moment I understood something the Council itself had not yet figured out. It was not only the Corvi delegates who had grown comfortable leaning on human judgment without ever officially crediting it. Somewhere along the way, our own command structure had quietly absorbed the same habit, expecting officers like Grace to break the rules whenever the rules failed to keep up, and then accepting the blame in private while denying it existed on any official record. Grace never faced formal punishment for Corin. The inquiry stalled, buried under the same patient silence Ambassador Bennett had been offering the Council for weeks, and I suspect that silence was entirely deliberate. Nobody wanted to explain, on a permanent record, why a commander who had personally saved 400 lives in a sector we had officially abandoned needed to be reprimanded for the act of saving them. But nobody praised her for it either. Grace kept that star chart open on her desk for the rest of that week, the small red points marking each new incident multiplying a little more every time either of us checked it, and I noticed she had stopped calling them isolated. She had started calling them a pattern instead, out loud, in briefings, in a tone that made at least 2 Fleet Command officers visibly uncomfortable, since acknowledging a pattern meant eventually having to decide what to do about it. Some weeks after Corin, when I finally sat down one evening and mapped out every incident report that had crossed Grace's desk since the walkout began, I understood we were no longer looking at an isolated flashpoint we could quietly manage around. Something was accelerating along the entire length of the Verge, and the Council's forces, however brave, however individually capable, had spent 3 years learning to fight beside us, never once training to fight instead of us. I did not know yet exactly how much worse things would get before anyone with real authority admitted that truth out loud. By then I had stopped counting incidents individually and started tracking them the way Grace did, as a single expanding shape on a star chart, one that grew a little larger every time either of us checked it. The Skarn were no longer testing shields and pulling back. They were committing to full engagements, and the Council forces meeting them, brave as they consistently were, kept making the same mistakes over and over, in slightly different combinations each time. Ships arrived without coordinated timing, sometimes hours apart when minutes would have mattered. Commanders waited for authorization chains that had never been built to move quickly, because for 3 years they had never once needed to move quickly on their own. Every after-action report I read said some version of the same sentence. Response delayed pending clearance. One report described a garrison ship holding position for 11 minutes after receiving a distress call, waiting for a duty officer 3 sectors away to confirm engagement authority, only for that same officer to approve the response after the outpost in question had already gone silent. Nobody in that chain of command had done anything wrong exactly. They had all followed the procedure in front of them perfectly. The procedure itself was simply built for a world that no longer existed. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that follows. The Corvi pilots I had flown beside for years were not cowards, and they were not incompetent. Yeral, the engineer who had stayed behind at Halden when Daniel shipped out, ran that station's systems better than almost anyone I had ever worked alongside. The problem was never courage, and it was never skill. It was infrastructure, plain and unglamorous, the kind of thing nobody notices until it stops holding weight it was never given credit for carrying in the first place. The problem was that an entire defense structure across the Verge had been built on the assumption of 2 fleets moving as one connected system, and now half of that system had gone quiet, and nobody had yet rebuilt the other half to function fully alone. I flew a joint drill with 2 Corvi pilots from a neighboring garrison, back before any of this started, and watched them execute a defensive maneuver so clean it looked choreographed, the kind of flying that took years to build trust for. The problem was never that trust had disappeared. The problem was that it had only ever been built in one direction. toward us, and nobody had thought to ask what would happen if we ever stepped back and let that structure stand on its own for a while. Ambassador Bennett understood this before the council did, which is why, in the weeks that followed, she did something that surprised even the people who worked closest to her every day. She agreed to a private meeting with a delegation from the Ilvex Compact, a species holding no formal seat on the Galactic Council, but with 3 border colonies sitting directly against the same stretch of the verge where Corin Outpost belonged. They had come to Earth requesting a bilateral defense agreement, human ships and Ilvex ships operating together, with no council oversight involved at all. I stood post outside the meeting room, close enough to hear most of it through the door left slightly open, which I do not believe was any kind of accident on Bennett's part. We have watched the council's response times since the incident at Corin, the lead Ilvex delegate said, a woman named Ree, whose translator device gave her voice an odd, layered quality, as though 2 people were speaking half a beat apart. They have not improved. Our own have not either, without your patrols running alongside ours. We are not interested in waiting for the council to resolve an internal disagreement that was never truly ours to begin with. I understand, Bennett said. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, Ambassador Ree. Any agreement we sign here will be made public. I have no interest in undermining the council quietly, from the shadows of a private arrangement. If we work together, the council will know, and they will not enjoy learning it from a routine report. May I ask you something in return? Bennett said, once the formal terms had mostly been settled. Why come to us directly, rather than raise this through the council's own dispute channels first? Ree's translator gave a small, layered pause before answering. Because we did, twice, over the past year, regarding smaller matters than this. Both requests are still, as far as I am aware, pending review. We did not have 3 more years to wait for a third. Good, Ree said, without a trace of hesitation. Let them not enjoy it. They have had weeks to notice what was happening on their own border, and they noticed nothing until we came to you instead of them. They signed the agreement 3 days later. I watched Councillor Drom's face when that news finally reached the Concord Hall, not because I had been invited into that particular closed session, but because Bennett brought a small human party, myself included, to an unrelated council briefing that same afternoon, and the news had clearly reached the chamber only minutes before we walked through its doors. Drom did not look angry, not in the way I had expected. He looked, instead, like a man watching a wall he had leaned his entire weight against for years suddenly develop its first visible crack. The council's formal response arrived 4 days after that, addressed directly to Ambassador Bennett, requesting, in carefully measured diplomatic language, clarification regarding Earth's continued absence from joint verge operations, and reaffirming the Council's, quote, unwavering commitment to a swift and mutually respectful resolution. Bennett's reply was 2 sentences long. I know, because I personally delivered the sealed response to the courier drone that carried it. It stated that Earth remained willing to discuss cooperative security arrangements whenever the Council wished to negotiate them as genuine equals, and that until such time, Earth would continue making its own arrangements with any partner who approached in good faith, exactly as it had with the Ilvex Compact. It was polite. It was also the most final piece of writing I had ever personally handled. For a short while after that, things actually seemed to hold steady. Reports from the Ilvex border colonies described fewer probing runs, and even a few of the smaller council garrisons along the verge began quietly requesting informal coordination with our own patrol schedules, unofficial arrangements that nobody in the Concord Hall had approved, and nobody seemed eager to ask about too closely. I let myself believe, for those few weeks, that the worst of it might already be behind us. I would like to say the story moves in a clean, straight line from there toward resolution, but it does not, because 2 weeks later, the Skarn struck Relin colony. I found out because Yerol calmed me directly, using a private line he and Daniel had quietly set up months earlier, meant for exactly this kind of emergency, the kind that moves through official channels far too slowly to matter when it counts. Ethan, is Daniel currently with your fleet? My chest went tight before I had even finished forming an answer. No. Why would he be? He is stationed at Relin Colony now. They moved him there for the reactor refit. It was meant to be a quiet post, 6 months of unglamorous maintenance work, far from anywhere the Skarn had ever bothered to look twice at, which was precisely why Fleet Command had approved sending him there instead of keeping him closer to the Verge's more obvious pressure points. There was a pause too long for any kind of comfort. Relin Colony is not answering hails, Ethan. Neither is the Council garrison assigned to protect it. We are picking up weapons fire on old joint frequencies nobody has monitored consistently since the patrols stood down. I did not wait to properly process the fear rising in my chest. I brought it straight to Grace, the same as I had with Corin, except this time Grace did not hesitate for even a single second, because this time it was not simply a stranger's frightened voice on a recording. "Get me Fleet Command," she said, already moving toward the comm station herself. Now, not the routing desk, an actual person, immediately. What happened over the following 20 minutes was the closest thing I ever witnessed to Earth admitting, out loud and without qualification, exactly how far things had truly gone. Fleet Command did not send 3 ships this time. They authorized the Vigilant, 2 additional cruisers, and a full wing of response craft, under the explicit justification of protecting human citizens and allied civilians in a colony with confirmed human personnel present and unaccounted for. It was not framed, anywhere in that authorization, as helping the Council. It did not need to be. It was simply what Earth had decided it was going to do, with or without anyone else's permission. I flew the Kestrel out ahead of the main formation, because speed mattered more than raw firepower in the first critical minutes, and because I genuinely could not have made myself sit still in a launch bay while Daniel's status remained completely unknown. My hands were not as steady on the controls as I wanted them to be. I noticed that, somewhere over the growing distance to Relin, and made myself breathe slower until it passed, because Daniel needed a pilot who could fly, not one who was simply afraid on his behalf. Relin Colony, when it finally came into view, looked considerably worse than Corin ever had. I had seen damaged stations before, in training footage if nowhere else, but none of those recordings had prepared me for how quiet a dying station actually sounds over an open channel, all the small routine chatter replaced by long stretches of static. Its outer ring had lost pressure along an entire section, visible even from a distance as a slow, silent bleed of debris and vapor catching what little starlight reached that far out. 2 Council garrison ships drifted nearby, damaged badly enough that I could not immediately tell whether they were still crewed or simply adrift. 6 Skarn ships held position around the colony's main structure, and this time they were not retreating from anything at all. Kestrel to Relin Colony. Does anyone copy? Static, then a voice, weak but present, cutting through on the 3rd attempt. This is Relin Engineering. We copy. We have people trapped in reactor maintenance. Section 4. The section is actively losing atmosphere. Section 4. Daniel's section. I did not wait for Grace's order this time, and to her lasting credit, she did not make me wait for it. Kestrel is inbound to Section 4 docking port, requesting immediate cover from anyone in range. Copy, Kestrel. Cover is yours. Go. Go now. I will not describe the next several minutes in careful technical detail because they blurred together the way genuine fear always does, faster than any account of it can properly convey afterward. I remember weaving between debris that used to be part of a hull. I remember the Kestrel's shields taking 2 hits hard enough to rattle every panel in the cockpit and send a spiderweb crack across one display. A warning tone I had never actually heard outside of a training simulator started cycling somewhere beneath the main console, low and insistent, telling me the hull integrity along my port side had dropped below a threshold I did not have time to look up properly. I ignored it, because stopping to read the manual was not going to keep either of us alive, and because some decisions in that cockpit had to be made faster than any checklist could keep up with. I remember finding the docking port still intact, against every reasonable expectation I had allowed myself on the way there, and burning every remaining second of fuel margin to hold position long enough for an emergency seal to lock against my own hull instead of the ruined station clamp beside it. For nearly a full minute after the seal engaged, nothing happened, and I sat there with alarms still sounding around me, watching a pressure gauge climb by fractions of a percent, with no way to know from the cockpit whether anyone on the other side of that hatch was even still alive to walk through it. Daniel came through that seal third, behind two engineers I did not recognize, coughing hard from thin air and moving slower than I wanted him to, but moving under his own power. He saw me through the cockpit glass before either of us said a single word, and something shifted visibly in his face. Something that told me he had genuinely not expected to see anyone come for him at all. Figured command would still be arguing about jurisdiction, he said, once he had enough breath back to manage full sentences, his voice rough but steady. I did not figure on you. I told him there was no time to explain the difference, though later, once we were both safely clear, I realized there was not really a difference to explain. Command had, in fact, spent several minutes arguing about exactly that. I had simply stopped waiting for them to finish. Behind us, the Vigilant and its full formation arrived, and this time there was no careful holding pattern, no 40-second countdown while a commander weighed whether the rules could bend. The Skarn ships that had spent the last hour treating Relin Colony like an easy, unguarded target broke formation and scattered the moment 3 human cruisers dropped out of transit directly into their midst, weapons already tracking every one of them. I watched the 2 Council garrison ships I had assumed were beyond any help slowly begin to stabilize their drift as their own damaged systems flickered back online, no longer facing 6 enemy ships entirely alone. Relin Colony's remaining population, just over 600 people, made it through the following 4 hours mostly intact, though its outer ring would need months of careful rebuilding afterward. I do not know the exact number of Skarn ships destroyed that day, and I am not especially interested in reciting it, because that particular number was never the one that mattered most to me. The number that mattered was 1, and he was sitting beside me in the Kestrel's cramped second seat, wrapped in a thermal blanket, telling me in a hoarse, half-laughing voice that he now owed Yarrell an extremely large drink for making that call in time. The formal reports that followed took a full week to circulate through every council channel, and when they finally did, they described something the council had spent 3 comfortable years never having to fully reckon with. Earth's response to Relin Colony had been fast, tightly coordinated, and entirely uninterested in asking anyone's permission first, and it had arrived while 2 separate council garrisons, working entirely without human coordination, remained pinned down and unable to help even one another. One of those garrison commanders, in a private note that somehow found its way to Grace rather than through any official channel, wrote that his crew had spent the entire engagement waiting for orders that never came, because the officer meant to issue them was 3 transit hops away, attending an unrelated council session. He did not blame Earth for arriving. He simply asked, plainly, why nobody had thought to ask us to stay. I was not present in the Concord Hall the day those reports were formally presented to the full council. I heard about it secondhand, from Ambassador Bennett's own staff, that Councillor Drom sat through the entire briefing without speaking a single time, which for a man who rarely let any session pass without commentary of some kind, apparently said more than any transcript ever could. What I did see with my own eyes, 3 days later, was a formal council transmission requesting that an in-person delegation be sent to Earth itself, at the council's own expense, to, quote, re-establish direct dialogue regarding the current state of Verge security. It was, according to Fleet Command's historians, the first time in the entire recorded history of the Council that such a delegation had ever traveled to a member world instead of simply summoning that world's ambassador back to the Concord Hall. It took me a moment to understand why a formal request for an in-person Council delegation would feel different from every other formal transmission we had received in the past several months, and then I realized It was the first one that did not include a single line reminding us of proper procedure. Grace read that line aloud to me twice before either of us fully believed what it actually meant. I had never seen her read anything twice before, not once, in all the months I had worked beside her. "They are coming to us," she said. "Feels different," I said, "than the last time we were all standing in the same room together." "It should feel different," Grace said. "Last time, they genuinely believed they were doing us a favor by paying attention at all." I did not know, standing in that briefing room with the transmission still glowing on the display between us, whether the council delegation was traveling to Earth to apologize, to negotiate, or simply to assess how much damage their own silence had actually done. I only knew that whatever they were coming to say, they were finally coming to say it in person, in a room where they could not simply close a session and walk away from the answer. The council delegation arrived on Earth a little over a week later, and I was assigned to the security detail meeting their shuttle, which meant I became one of the first humans to watch Counselor Drom step onto human soil for the first time in his very long life. Part of me wanted to feel something like triumph, watching him walk down that ramp onto ground his own council had spent 3 years treating as merely useful. Mostly what I felt instead was tired, the particular exhaustion of having spent months watching people get hurt over a lesson that should never have needed teaching in the first place. He did not look like the man from the Concord Hall. That version of Drom had worn his authority comfortably, the way a person wears a coat they have owned so long they no longer notice its weight. This version moved carefully, almost formally, the way someone moves through a place they have privately begun to suspect they misjudged badly. "Ambassador Bennett," he said, and even his tone had shifted from the one I remembered. "Thank you for receiving us on such short notice." "Counselor," Bennett said, and nothing more beyond that, though it was not unfriendly. It was simply even, measured, giving nothing extra away, the same tone she might use with an old colleague who had once done her wrong and was only now beginning to understand it, careful not to offer forgiveness before it had actually been earned. He asked her, as they walked together toward the briefing complex, whether Commander Hollis would be present for any part of the coming discussions. Bennett told him Grace had been invited and had declined, at least for the first 2 days. She said she did not think her presence would help anyone listen more carefully to the data, Bennett said. I told her I agreed, and that she was welcome to change her mind at any point. Drom nodded slowly, as though turning that answer over and finding it heavier than he expected. Behind him, the rest of the council delegation filed out of the shuttle in careful order, 6 delegates from 6 different founding worlds, none of whom had ever set foot on a human colony before, let alone Earth itself. A few of them glanced up at the open sky the way visitors sometimes did, as if surprised a planet could still have so much uninterrupted weather. I found myself studying Drom's face for some sign of the man who had once told Grace her judgment did not matter compared to procedure, and for a moment I almost missed the resemblance entirely. It was still him, the same measured posture, the same careful diction, but something around his eyes had changed in the months since the Concord Hall, the look of someone recalculating a sum he had been certain of for a very long time. The delegation's first 2 days on Earth were, by careful design, almost entirely informational. Fleet Command walked them through 18 months of joint operation logs, the kind of unglamorous raw data nobody bothers reading closely until they urgently need to understand exactly how something used to work before it quietly stopped working. I sat in on part of that briefing, standing near the back of the room the way I nearly always did, and I watched Drom's expression shift as a young logistics officer named Laura Whitfield, who normally spent her days buried in supply manifests rather than diplomacy, calmly walked the delegation through a chart most of them had clearly never once seen before that morning. It showed response times across the entire verge for the 3 years before the walkout, set directly against the weeks that followed it. Before the walkout, Laura said, her voice steady and entirely without embellishment, the average combined response time to a distress signal along the verge was 14 minutes. That number includes every recorded incident, small and large alike. After the walkout, for incidents where no human unit was present or authorized to respond, the average climbed to just over 4 hours. For incidents where a human unit did ultimately respond, whether formally authorized in advance or not, the average returned to under 20 minutes. Nobody in the delegation said anything at all for a long moment. I watched several of them glance toward Counselor Drom, as if waiting for him to offer the counter-argument he usually would have had ready before anyone else finished speaking. He offered nothing, and simply kept watching the chart. "I want to be clear that this is not offered as a boast," Laura continued, glancing briefly around the room. "It is simply what the recorded data shows, plainly, without interpretation attached. The Verge was never secured by the Council alone, and it was never secured by humanity alone either. It was secured by 2 fleets that had spent 3 years quietly learning to move as a single coordinated system, and for the weeks since the walkout began, only half of that system has still been moving at all." One of the younger delegates, seated near the back of the delegation, asked whether the numbers might simply reflect unfamiliarity rather than any genuine structural gap, suggesting that Council forces would naturally improve with time as they adjusted to operating without human support. Laura did not answer with an opinion. She simply pulled up 11 weeks of week-by-week data, showing response times that had not meaningfully improved at any point since the walkout began. The delegate did not ask a follow-up question. Drom asked one question, quietly, near the very end of the presentation. Why did none of this appear in any Council assessment before now, before this exact moment? Laura glanced toward Ambassador Bennett before answering, a silent question of her own passing between them, and Bennett gave the smallest possible nod in response. "Because nobody ever asked us for it, Counselor," Laura said. "The Council received summary reports throughout, the kind with conclusions already attached. It never once requested the underlying data itself. I do not believe that omission was deliberate on anyone's part. I think it simply never occurred to anyone in your chamber that the raw numbers might tell a meaningfully different story than the one everyone already comfortably believed." I watched something settle in Drom's face at that answer. Something considerably heavier than the polite discomfort he had been quietly carrying since he first stepped off the shuttle 2 days earlier. I remember thinking, walking out of that briefing alongside the rest of the security detail, that the hardest part might already be over. The data had been presented, the numbers had done their own convincing, without anyone needing to raise their voice. I was wrong about that, though not in any way I could have predicted standing in that room. That evening, while the delegation's formal talk stood adjourned until morning, the Scarn made their move. I did not learn the full details until later, pieced together slowly from briefings I was allowed to attend and a few I was pointedly not, but the shape of it was this. The Scarn remnant, watching the Council's own leadership travel to Earth and sensing, correctly, that Council forces along the Verge were now more distracted and less coordinated than at any point since the walkout began, committed nearly their entire remaining fleet strength to a single concentrated strike against Meridian Point, the small human listening post where I had once stood relay duty myself, chosen specifically because it sat close enough to Earth's own territory to make a genuine statement, and far enough from the main fleet to look, on paper at least, like an easy and undefended target. It was not an easy target, not anymore. Because for the first time since the walkout began, there was no ambiguity about authorization, no 40-second countdown for a commander to privately weigh whether the rules might bend, no quiet unsanctioned dash across a border that technically was not ours to cross. Meridian Point sat inside recognized human territory. Its defense required no one's permission but Earth's own, and Earth had already made that position unmistakably clear to every ship in the fleet the moment Rellan Colony's reports had come back weeks earlier. The alert reached me at close to midnight, and this time there was no scramble of confusion beforehand, no minutes lost figuring out who had the authority to give an order. Fleet Command's automated defense protocol had already begun moving ships into position before a single human voice confirmed the threat. because Meridian Point sat inside a perimeter that no longer required anyone's permission to defend. Grace led the response personally, and this time she did not need to fight through 4 layers of routing desk to make it happen. I flew the Kestrel as part of her wing, alongside Redtail and Osprey once again, the same 2 pilots I had flown beside at Halden months earlier, and for the first time in a long while, it felt less like a desperate emergency and considerably more like something we had genuinely trained our entire careers to execute cleanly, without hesitation. Redtail took point on the first pass, calling out targeting solutions in the same clipped shorthand we had used at Halden months earlier, and Osprey answered every call within seconds, the 2 of them moving like they had never actually stopped flying together in the time between. I fell into the rhythm beside them without needing to think about it, and somewhere in the middle of that engagement, I realized I was not afraid anymore, not the way I had been at Corin, not the way I had been over Relin. This time, we were not scrambling to catch up to a crisis already underway. We were simply doing the job, on our own ground, with every resource we needed already in hand. I am not going to walk through every maneuver of that engagement either, though I remember most of them clearly enough. What I will say is that it took under 30 minutes from first contact to full withdrawal, that Meridian Point's defenses barely dipped below 80% shield strength across the entire engagement, and that of the Skarn fleet committed to that single strike, whatever portion survived, did not attempt another major offensive along the verge for the remainder of that year. I brought the Kestrel back down through Meridian Point's landing corridor a little after 2 in the morning, tired in the particular way that comes from a fight that never actually felt like it was going to be lost, and found Redtail already leaning against the hangar wall, helmet under one arm, grinning at nothing in particular. "Feels different when you are not the last line of defense," she said. I told her it felt like the way this was always supposed to work. Osprey joined us a few minutes later, already stripping off half his flight suit in the warm hangar air, and for a while, the 3 of us just stood there, not saying much of anything, letting the adrenaline drain out slowly instead of trying to talk it away. The full report reached the council delegation the following morning, before their second day of talks had even formally reopened. I was told, again secondhand, that Councillor Drom read it standing up, at a small side table near the window, before anyone else in his delegation had finished their morning coffee, and that he did not sit back down again for several long minutes afterward. When the formal session finally resumed, he asked to speak first, which was unusual enough on its own that the rest of his delegation visibly noticed and exchanged glances. "Ambassador Bennett," he said. "Months ago, in the Concord Hall, I told Commander Hollis that outcomes were immaterial to procedure. I want to correct that statement now, not as a diplomatic courtesy offered for the record, but because I have spent the last 2 days learning in detail exactly how wrong it was." Bennett did not say anything yet. She simply waited, wearing the same patient stillness I had watched her use in that very chamber months earlier. "The council did not build the peace along the verge," Drom continued, choosing each word with visible care. "We assumed we had, because the peace held for 3 years, and we mistook holding for building. What actually held that peace together all along was a partnership we treated as optional, right up until the exact moment we discovered it had been load-bearing the entire time." He paused, and for a man who had never once, in my presence, sounded genuinely uncertain, the next part came out slowly, almost carefully. "I do not know if this council still deserves the chance to rebuild that partnership. I do know that I was wrong, and I did not want to say so only once the data had forced my hand. I wanted to say it because it is true, regardless of what it costs me to admit." Beside him, the same narrow, pale-eyed delegate who had spoken against Grace in that very first session all those months ago said nothing at all, though I noticed he did not look away from Drom either, and did not offer any objection of his own to what had just been said. I do not know if it counted, in the council's own formal legal sense, as an actual apology. I do know it was the first time in the entire recorded history of that body, according to Fleet Command's own historians, that a sitting counselor had personally acknowledged an error toward a member species without first being compelled to by a formal grievance process. Ambassador Bennett let the silence sit for a long moment before she finally answered. "Thank you, counselor," she said. "I believe you. I also want to be honest with you about something in return, because I think you have earned that honesty today. We did not walk out of that hall to punish this council. We walked out because we had spent 3 years being asked to act as an equal partner while quietly being treated as a useful subordinate, and I decided we would rather stand still entirely than keep accepting terms that never once matched the actual work we were doing." "And now?" Drom asked. "Now," Bennett said, "we find out whether this council is finally capable of writing terms that honestly reflect that." The rest of that session passed in a kind of careful, deliberate quiet, delegates speaking in measured tones about frameworks and drafting committees. None of the theater I had grown used to watching in the Concord Hall. I stood near the back, the way I always did, and understood that I was watching something rarer than a policy change. I was watching an institution admit, in front of the species it had spent 3 years quietly underestimating, that it had been wrong. The negotiations that followed took 11 days, which Ambassador Bennett later told me was the fastest the council had ever moved on anything substantial in its entire recorded history. I was not present in the room for most of the actual drafting. The sessions I did attend took place in a smaller chamber adjoining the main Concord Hall, a room built for drafting rather than declarations, with none of the rising tiered seating that made the main floor feel like a stage. My part in this story had mostly been flying and waiting and occasionally breaking rules that badly needed breaking, and I understood well enough that treaty language was never built by pilots. What I did see, because Bennett kept a small rotating security detail present throughout the process, myself included, on 3 separate days, was enough to understand the shape the new terms were slowly taking. The hardest disagreements, from what I overheard, were never really about humanity at all. They were about precedent, about what granting Earth a full seat and full autonomy would mean for every other member species watching from the sidelines, some of whom had waited far longer than 3 years for privileges the founding worlds had never once questioned keeping for themselves. Councillor Drom argued, more than once, that the Council could either address that imbalance honestly now, while it still had some credibility left to spend, or watch it force its way out through some future crisis instead. One afternoon, sitting near the back of a smaller drafting session, I watched Bennett push back against a proposal that would have granted Earth its new seat only after a formal probationary period, 3 years of demonstrated good faith before the vote actually carried weight. "You are describing the exact arrangement we just walked away from," she told the drafting committee, without raising her voice. "A seat that exists on paper, pending a trust nobody has bothered building in return. I am not interested in a second probationary period. If this council believes we have earned a seat, it can say so now, plainly, or it can continue negotiating with an ambassador who has already shown you what happens when we stop believing our own patience is being respected." The probationary language was removed from the draft within the hour. Commander Hollis's original reprimand from the Concord Hall was formally struck from every council record, replaced with a citation for exceptional judgment under emergency conditions, the same words that could have described her actions the very first time, if anyone in that chamber had actually wanted to use them then. Human forces operating anywhere along the verge would retain full autonomous authority to respond to imminent threats without prior council clearance, a right no member species besides the founding Corvi seats had ever previously held. And Earth itself would receive a full council seat, not the advisory status we had operated under for 3 uneasy years, the kind of seat that came attached to an actual vote instead of a polite suggestion. I watched the final vote happen from the observation gallery above the Concord Hall, the same room where I had once stood behind Ambassador Bennett and watched her walk out in the middle of a session. This time, when the vote came up on the chamber's main display, it was not unanimous. 2 delegates from smaller founding seats voted openly against extending full autonomy to a species barely a few centuries removed from its own homeworld, and one of them rose to say so directly, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's careful acoustics. "I do not dispute the data," he said. "I dispute the precedent. Once this council grants full autonomous authority based on demonstrated competence, every member species will eventually demand the same standard be applied to them, and this body will lose the very structure that allows it to function as one coherent council rather than a loose collection of independent fleets." From the observer gallery reserved for non-member species, I noticed Ambassador Rhee lean forward slightly, though she had no vote and no standing to speak in that session at all. She did not need one. Her presence alone, sitting in a gallery the Ilvex Compact had never before bothered attending, said enough about how closely every border species was now watching what this particular vote would decide. Councillor Drom answered him before Bennett had even risen from her seat. "Then perhaps," Drom said, "this council should have built a structure worth preserving through partnership rather than through quiet dependence it never once acknowledged. I did not arrive at this position lightly, Councillor, and I will not pretend the concern you raise is without merit, but I have personally seen what this body's caution costs when it is applied to people who have already proven, repeatedly and at real cost to themselves, exactly where their judgment stands. I would rather risk the precedent than risk repeating the weeks we have all just survived." A third delegate, one who had said nothing through the entire session, finally raised her hand to speak. "I came into this chamber prepared to vote against this measure," she said. "I have changed my mind in the last few minutes, not because of anything in the data, which I found convincing weeks ago, but because I have just watched a delegate from one of our oldest founding seats argue against his own comfort in open session. That is not something procedure can manufacture. I would like this council to reward it." The measure passed, comfortably, in the end, and Councillor Drom was the delegate who called the final tally himself, his voice steady across the chamber. I noticed his hand did not shake once, reading out the final numbers, though I wondered afterward how much effort that steadiness had actually cost him. The chamber did not erupt into any kind of celebration, which felt right, given everything that vote had actually cost to arrive at. A few delegates offered quiet nods across the aisle toward the small human party seated near the back. Ambassador Rhee, still watching from the observer gallery, caught my eye for just a moment and inclined her head slightly, the closest thing to a formal acknowledgement her people's customs apparently allowed in a chamber that was not technically hers to address. Ambassador Bennett was asked afterward, in a brief statement to council press representatives crowding near the hall's exit, whether Earth intended to pursue any formal censure against the delegates who had authored the original reprimand against Commander Hollis. "No," she said, simply, without hesitation. "We did not walk away from this council to punish anyone sitting in it. We walked away because we were tired of being useful without ever being respected for it. Those are two very different things, and this council finally seems to understand the difference between them. That understanding is enough for us." News of the new terms reached Halden Station a full day before I did, and by the time my transport docked, someone had already painted over the temporary repair markings along the lower ring with the station's proper insignia, restored in full for the first time since the attack. It struck me as a small thing to notice. Freshly painted metal against scorched plating that had not quite finished being replaced, but it felt like the most honest summary of where we actually stood, not fully healed, simply, finally, no longer pretending otherwise. I found Daniel 3 days after the vote, back on Halden Station, which had been fully repaired and fully restaffed by then, this time with a genuine joint human and Corvi maintenance crew working the lower ring together, rather than one team quietly covering for another team's forced absence. Yarol was there too, showing Daniel a modification to the shield relay system that, Yarol insisted with visible pride, would have made the entire business at Halden, months earlier, considerably less dramatic, had it existed sooner. It was a small thing, a redundant power routing loop that would have kept life support running in Section 4 even with the primary relay destroyed entirely, the kind of improvement that comes only from someone who has personally lived through the alternative. "You look tired," Daniel said, when he finally noticed me standing in the doorway. "You look like someone who nearly lost an entire reactor a while back." "Fair enough." He grinned, the first real, unguarded grin I had seen from him since Relin Colony. "Yarol tells me the new joint patrol schedule actually has us flying together again next month. A real schedule this time, not a quiet favor someone approved off the books." "A real schedule," I agreed. "Feels strange, saying that out loud. Good strange, or bad strange?" I thought about it honestly before answering, because he deserved an honest answer, and because I had spent the better part of a year learning exactly how much that particular question mattered. Good strange. We earned it the hard way, all of it, but I think that means it might actually hold this time, longer than the last version ever did. Yarol looked up from the shield relay panel long enough to add his own opinion, in the careful, deliberate English he had picked up over years of working alongside human engineers. "It will hold," he said, "because now there is a document that says it must, and because of what happened when there was not. I have found that people remember consequences considerably longer than they remember promises." Daniel laughed at that, the sound easy and unguarded, and for a moment the three of us just stood there in the half-repaired corridor, listening to the sound of new conduit being welded into place somewhere above us. Grace found me on the observation deck later that same evening, watching Halden's lower ring lights come back on section by section as the last of the repair crews finished their shift for the day. She had been offered, and had accepted, a formal advisory position on the newly restructured Joint Command, the kind of role that would have been genuinely unthinkable to offer a human commander little more than a year earlier. "Counselor Drom asked to speak with me privately before I left the hall today," she said, leaning against the railing beside me. "He wanted to apologize again, in person this time, away from the cameras and the permanent record." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I did not need a second apology. One that actually meant something was worth considerably more to me than a dozen that did not." She was quiet for a moment, watching the lights below us. "I also told him that if his council ever forgets this particular lesson again, it will not take 3 years next time. It will not need to. We will simply stop showing up the moment it stops being mutual, and we will not wait around for another Concord Hall session to explain exactly why." "Do you think he believed you?" "I think," Grace said slowly, "he spent the last several months learning firsthand exactly how quickly trust disappears once you decide it does not require any tending at all. I think that particular lesson tends to stay learned once it has actually been taught the hard way." "What happens to you now?" I asked her. "Advisory seat on the new Joint Command," she said, "which mostly means I get to sit in rooms and explain, in careful diplomatic language, why the thing I did without permission a year ago was actually the correct decision all along. Sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she actually smiled, tired but genuine. "I will take exhausting over ignored." Before I left Halden that week, Fleet Command forwarded me a short notice I almost missed among a dozen routine updates. My own record from Corin and Relin had been formally reviewed alongside Grace's, and rather than the reprimand I had quietly expected for months, it carried a single line of commendation, plain and unadorned. I did not need the citation. I had never once flown out to any of those stations because I expected a document to thank me for it afterward. But I kept it anyway, folded into the same jacket pocket where I still carried a photo of the Kestrel's original crew, back before any of us understood what the next year was going to cost, or what it would eventually give back. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, long after Grace had gone to get some genuine rest and Halden's ring lights had finished cycling fully back on, every section lit for the first time since the attack that had nearly taken Daniel from all of us. I thought about Counselor Drom's voice in that very first session, telling Grace flatly that outcomes were immaterial to procedure, and I thought about the very different version of him standing at that small side table months later, reading a casualty count of 0 before his morning coffee had even gone cold, finally understanding what his own comfortable procedures had actually been quietly costing everyone involved all along. The Galactic Council did not lose a war. Nobody I knew, human or otherwise, would have wanted that particular outcome, not even after everything that had happened along the verge. What it lost instead was something quieter and considerably harder, I suspect, to fully win back on command alone. It lost the comfortable assumption that humanity would always simply be there to catch what fell, regardless of how it was treated in the meantime. I used to think Grace and Ambassador Bennett led in more or less the same way, since they both seemed to make impossible decisions look simple from the outside. I understand now that they never actually worked the same way at all. Grace led by acting first and explaining afterward, trusting that the outcome would eventually speak for itself even when the process could not. Bennett led by refusing to act at all, by simply declining to participate in a system that no longer deserved her participation, and waiting, with more patience than I ever managed to have myself, for that refusal to become its own kind of argument. I do not know which approach costs more. I suspect they cost about the same, in different currencies, and I am grateful neither of them ever had to spend only their own. We did not walk away from that peace table to prove a point to anyone. Ambassador Bennett never once, in any conversation I personally overheard or was quietly part of, framed the walkout as a lesson deliberately taught to teach the Council a hard truth. She framed it, every single time, the same simple way. We stopped accepting terms that did not honestly reflect the truth of what we were actually doing out there, and then we waited, patiently, and without a single threat spoken aloud, for that truth to become impossible for anyone to keep ignoring. It became impossible to ignore at Corin, and then again at Relin Colony, and then finally, decisively, at Meridian Point, 3 separate moments where the gap between what the Council believed about its own strength and what that strength actually depended on grew too wide for anyone to paper over with another polite memo. I think about Ambassador Rhee sometimes too, and the Ilvex Compact's quiet decision to stop waiting for a body that had never once prioritized their concerns over its own comfort. I do not think humanity taught the galaxy that lesson alone. I think we simply happened to be the first ones with enough leverage to make the lesson impossible to avoid, and I suspect the Council's own historians will spend considerably longer than 11 weeks deciding what that means for every other member species still waiting patiently for a seat at that long, pale table. I do not know if every single member of that Council fully understands, even now, exactly what almost broke along the verge during those difficult weeks. I know Counselor Drom understands it completely, because I personally watched the exact moment it happened to him, standing at that small side table with a report shaking slightly in his hands and his coffee slowly going cold beside it. And I know that the next time anyone in that chamber is tempted to mistake quiet cooperation for guaranteed obedience, someone in that room is going to remember exactly how quickly Halden Station's lights went dark, and exactly how long it took the Council to notice that darkness on its own, without anyone having to point it out to them. I do not say that as a threat, and neither, I think, would Ambassador Bennett. I say it simply as the truest thing I know about what actually changed, more true than any clause in that new treaty, more true than the seat now waiting for us in that chamber. That, more than any treaty, more than any single vote, more than any seat at that long pale table, is the part of this story I actually believe will last. I still fly the Kestrel most weeks, usually alongside Redtail and Osprey, sometimes alongside Corvi wingmen, whose names I am slowly learning to pronounce properly. The patrol schedules are real now, posted openly instead of arranged quietly off the books, and when I look at the roster before a shift, I no longer see it as a simple list of call signs and ship names. I see it as a record of everyone who chose to keep showing up. On both sides of that old divide, once showing up finally meant something again. That, I think, is the only kind of peace worth walking back into a room for.